Welcome to Ways We Mom. This is a new segment we are doing on the S.U.R.E Parenting Podcast. And I have with me today Kim Cooper, who I met in 2018 at the Moms on Fire retreat. So first, I would like you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do, and then we'll dive into the topic for today.
Sure. My business is called Pathfinder Healing Arts, and I'll just tell a little bit about the story of the Pathfinder and why that's important to me. And you know me, and you know I start to cry every time I tell this story. But I used to be an airline pilot, and in aviation, the Pathfinder is the first airplane that flies out after a storm. And they kind of chart a safe course for all those that follow behind them. And I feel like in every family, and especially every generation, there is a Pathfinder. There's somebody that does things a little bit differently. Sometimes they're labeled the black sheep of the family, and that doesn't mean necessarily because they're doing something wrong. Like, I'm the black sheep of my family, and it's because I was the first one that went to college. I don't hunt. I was a vegetarian for a little while. I believe in conscious parenting, so it just basically means you're different than the rest of your family, but you're also willing to see things in a different way. And I think a lot of your listeners are probably the Pathfinder in their family. They're the ones that are willing to go out and do a little research, look at their own lives and see, is there something I can change? Is there something I can do differently? So I work with what I would call Pathfinders. And the thing I've been focusing a lot on lately is kind of generational issues, and also the places where we feel like there's an us versus them being set up. And I'm a big believer in trying to see all sides of the situation and building bridges with people on the other side to kind of try and meet in the middle. And I know often people will say, well, there is no middle. There's, right and there's wrong. And so that's where I try and see, like, what can we do to make a better society for our kids by not being so polarizing?
I absolutely love that. And I agree wholeheartedly. When you talked about Pathfinders at Moms on Fire, I myself also cried because I finally had a word for it.
Yeah.
And it can be isolating and it can be lonely, and it is so worth it.
Yeah.
And I think it can also harden you a little bit. And I know I've been subject to that myself, where black and white thinking is a little bit easier than all of the nuance of gray.
Yes.
But I firmly believe that the vast majority of life is gray. And
yes.
One of the ways that Brene Brown talks about reducing this shaming that we do in society is leaning in, actually getting to know somebody, quote unquote, on the other side. And the more you get to know them, the more you see them as a whole person with a complex background, not just this villainous trait that you have deemed as that. And so I value the type of work you do, and particularly, the Pathfinder support has been very helpful for me personally. So what brought us here today was the topic of family boundaries, all the way to like cutting off a family member. And for myself, I came from a volatile household, and I attempted to keep those lines of communication open and guarded for a long time. And I got to a point in my healing where I went no contact, which is a term that I've seen used a lot in support groups for people who had narcissistic parents. And it can be the right approach. And I believe at the time that it was, I went no contact for about 4 years. And that's not easy to do. And I think that sometimes people think like, oh, I'll just completely cut them off and then life will be great. There's a lot of emotion though. There's a lot of pain and frustration, and there's a lot left unsaid, and still it can be the right thing to do. And as we were discussing this in our Facebook group, Empowering Moms to Uplift Kids, you brought in a very different perspective that I hadn't considered, which for me highlighted my bias, because I'm obviously prone to putting people into my background, into my situation and how I see these situations. And you were able to come in with a completely different perspective that I thought would be incredibly beneficial for our listeners. because it isn't always the case that there's somebody who's incredibly narcissistic or somebody who's abusive. Sometimes that's not the case at all. It's just differences. And so I would love for you to expand a little bit on how you viewed that situation without names or specifics, because we haven't actually brought that mom into this conversation. But in general, what's another way we can view these differences?
I think there's so many things. So you touched on something. You had a lot of abuse in your background. I fortunately have not. So my background, like all of our experiences are what shape our beliefs. And the thing that I would like to invite people to this as they listen to us talk is not to like, I am no expert. I am no guru. I don't, have all the answers. I struggle with a lot of this stuff myself, but take what I say and really look at it and examine it and examine your beliefs, because so often, like we have new information come at us every single day, but yet the majority of us, I think I saw a study that said like 90%, but I don't remember where the study was, so I couldn't quote it. But the majority of us keep the same beliefs that we had yesterday. We don't use those new beliefs that may not, or the new information. And some of our beliefs may not even have been ours. They may have been like what we were taught from our parents, right? So all I'm asking is that like people look and examine what I say and then see if it fits for you. If it doesn't fit for you, throw it out. And like in some cases, abuse, things like that, like probably some of the stuff you went through, yeah, there may be no solution but to cut people off. But what I'm seeing a lot of is people cutting people off just because they have a different style of parenting or just because they think about things a little differently. And so one of the things I want to point out is, especially generationally, there's a lot, like if I use my own life, for example, my mom is 80 years old and I'm 48 and I have 5-year-old twins. So the way my mom was brought up, she was born in 1939. Things were acceptable then and accepted as parenting that are not accepted now. So one example for me is shame. Like I am very familiar with Brene Brown's work. It really resonates with me. I think shame is very toxic and I will not shame my kids. But I've done a lot of studying about how the child's brain works too, and a lot of the new studies that are coming out about developmental things with kids that I know about that my 80-year-old mom does not. Now, one of the things she used to say to us growing up to keep us in line, her favorite phrase was shame on you. She doesn't see anything wrong with that. She doesn't know why that can be toxic. And one day we were talking and she said, shame on you to my kids. And I was like, I got kind of mad and I was like, do not say that to them. In my better times, I can like have a conversation about it. But in this time, I got really defensive and really mad. And I was like, I do not shame my kids. Don't say that to them. And she said, I think you're being too sensitive. And I said, Mom, they're my kids. And basically the tone was like, I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't care what you think. And then I stopped for a minute and I thought, wow, what if my kid, I know my mom loves my kids as much as I do, right? She just has a different point of view about things. And I thought, what if my kid grows up and we're talking and he says something to me that I completely disagree with. And then he says, Mom, they're my kids and I'm going to do what I want to do. How would that make me feel? Mm-hmm. And so I very much try, again, I'm not talking about extreme cases like abuse or things like that, but I very much try and put myself in the other person's shoes and think like, wow, she's 80 years old. This was acceptable when she was growing up, and she's not going to change her lifelong beliefs in a day. But if I can stay calm and explain to her why I feel like shame is so detrimental, then that gives us a chance to kind of bridge that gap and get closer instead of me just saying, I don't want my kids hanging around my mom because she shames them.
And I think what's interesting is that in this exact example, if we, so often when we approach a difference, we want to win.
Yes.
So we go to the most extreme argument we can. And when it's coming to ourselves and our parents, we will say things like, you will destroy their self-esteem for the rest of their lives. And while yes, chronic shame and daily shame could cause lifelong harm, that's not what your mom's doing. She makes one comment. Right. And so if we go there, are we in fact shaming our parents?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is my argument is like what we are trying to teach our kids and help our kids learn. We are turning around and doing the exact same thing to the people that we don't agree with. And none of us have really been taught how to have a conversation about conflict, right? Like religion and politics are just two big ones. But like this is another perfect example where if I just go straight into shaming my mom because she's doing something she didn't even realize was wrong or just the difference of opinion, then what am I teaching my kids? I'm saying, like, I don't want to shame you, but I'll turn around and shame grandma because she thinks different than I do.
And what are her options at that point but to dig in her heels and defend herself?
Exactly. Exactly. And it's so much in the approach. If you can approach it with someone in a way that does not immediately put them on the defensive. Like I was thinking of an example. I could give them one example is if like somebody, especially of an older generation, when it was more accepted, is saying like something that's racist or an example of like, I don't like what that guy's doing, I'm gonna shoot him, like just goofing around. And in the past, this is where our conversation has really made me look at my own beliefs and values, because I have been very wanting to keep my kids in a bubble and not be around people like that and not hear things like that. And what I've really started thinking about since this week that we've been talking is, would I rather have them exposed to that stuff when I can explain it to them and when I can discuss it with them? Or would I rather have the first time they hear that be when they're in school or on the street or something like that? So like in that case, the way I would approach it both ways is to maybe go to the person that said those things and be like, hey, I don't know if you realize this or not. I know you're just goofing around, but if my kid goes into school and says, I'm going to shoot somebody, they can be expelled right away. Things are different now. And so if he hears you saying that, he may not realize that you're just joking around. And if he goes into school and says that, he could get in really big trouble. So would you mind trying not to say that around him? And in that way, I think it doesn't shame the person. It doesn't make them wrong. It doesn't make them have to stand up and be defensive, but you're explaining to them why you don't want that behavior around your kid. And then later you talk to your kid and you're like, hey, what do you think about what that person said? And maybe this is why I don't think that fits in with our family values and why we do things differently. And my family has always accused me of like coddling my kids and babying my kids and not letting, like, one of the biggest arguments my brother and I ever had was when we were on vacation and I wouldn't let my kids watch PJ Masks because I didn't like the way one of the characters behaved. And now I'm really looking at my own beliefs about that and thinking, would I rather have them see that stuff when I'm around and able to explain it to them rather than trying to keep them totally away from it when they're going to be exposed to it at some time or another.
Yeah, and I think that there's definitely kind of classifications. There's certain,
Yes,
I'm not going to let you do drugs in front of my children, regardless
of course.
anything. And, some PJ Masks, it's funny you bring up because I actually kind of despise that show, and I don't exactly understand why. Like I haven't, but my children act very different if they've watched a couple of episodes of PJ Masks versus even like Power Rangers, which like, they're fighting and they're getting the bad guys and whatever. But there's something about the way that show is put together that they watch it and it alters their behavior. And so I was able to point that out to them. Like,
yes.
Do you see how you guys are talking to each other? Do you see how you're, kicking each other and like physically harming each other, more than like we're roughhousing, but like actually seeking to do harm? This doesn't usually happen. And I think the catalyst might be the show. Obviously, I don't say the word catalyst, but I think it might be because of the show. And thank the heavens, my 6-year-old is incredibly analytical. And so he actually thought about that. And he was like, well, maybe. So he asked if we could do an experiment, which is kind of a go-to phrase in our house. Can we do an experiment?
I love that.
It can be very fun. Yesterday, it was putting Cheerios in root beer. But anyways.
I love that.
So I said, sure. So we watched normal, like the things that I don't see causing a negative effect. Things like Power Rangers. They're still in, very stereotypical boy shows. Like, and they actually also like some stereotypical girl shows, and I don't see too much of an issue with most of those, although one of them has a character that whines nonstop, and then my 6-year-old will pick up that whining tone.
Mm-hmm.
I have to limit that
Mm-hmm.
one too. But anyhow, so they watch the other shows, go on with our day. A couple days later, we watch PJ Masks again, and the same thing happens. And he goes, I think you're right. It makes us fight
Wow.
more. And that is not something I expect of a 6-year-old. He is a special case.
Yeah, right, right. Some of them won't get it, they'll just be like, Mom, no, I don't see it. But that's amazing. And then him seeing it for himself rather than you just telling him makes it 10 times more powerful.
And it's valid to say, you know, this thing makes me feel or act a certain way. I personally, since becoming a mom, I can't watch Law and Order SVU anymore. I used to binge watch that show.
And sorry, you cut out. You did, which is it?
Law and Order SVU.
Oh, yeah. I get it.
Just emotionally, it hits me in a way that as a parent, I can't stomach.
I get it.
And that doesn't make it a bad show. That doesn't make people who watch it bad. For me, it's not a good fit. And I really, really try to drill that into my kids that something can be not a good fit for you. That doesn't mean that other people have to do the same thing as you.
See, but I think that's brilliant because right there, you're letting them see that different people have different beliefs and different thoughts, and you choose what, works for you, and then they're going to choose. But how do we get along with those other people and not just completely have to cut them off?
And I think that my struggle has been doing it in the reverse order, because with my kids, it's, we as a family are allergic to food dyes. So he'll see other kids eating candy, and he used to feel like, well, why would they be eating colors? That's toxic. And, I hear my language coming out of his mouth stronger than it probably should have been to begin with. And I'm like, the thing is, we have to make the choices that are right for us and our bodies, but other people get to make their own choices. And so helping him do that, it makes me have to think for, okay, well, maybe my mom wants to eat a donut for breakfast, and maybe she is going to eat that donut in front of my kids, and my kids have to learn that they're making a different choice even than grandma. My mom smokes is probably a better example than eating. She also eats donuts for breakfast.
Yeah.
But I don't think she's done that in front of my kids, and she doesn't actually smoke in front of my kids, but she will smell like smoke.
Yeah,
and
right.
So they're like, what's that? I'm like, it's cigarette smoke. Cigarettes are bad. Well, that's grandma's choice, and yes, I would love for her to quit smoking. Also, that is not mine to do.
Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of I see people getting hung up. Is like one of my favorite phrases is you get it when you get it. We have all come to where we are because we were ready to learn or change or grow or have that epiphany moment, that aha moment where we're like, oh, okay, I get it now. I'm going to start doing something different. What I would have been guilty of in the past is because I've had that epiphany moment or because this book has changed my life. Here now, my husband has to read it and he's got to change his life because it was so profound for me. He's not necessarily in that same place yet. So he's not going to get it the same way I get it. And if we expect someone to meet us where we are just because we're ready for it, they may very well not be. But what I'm looking at, this has really helped me see the places where like, wow, that's an opportunity to talk to my kids about it instead of trying to just keep them away from those people and those situations.
Absolutely. I think that there's only so much sheltering that we can do. And, kids are not as fragile as we make them out to be. There's an interesting book that I haven't read yet, but I watched an interview with the author called, I think it's called Anti-Fragile. If it isn't called that, that's the word that he used to describe certain things that actually get stronger with stress. Bones are one of the big examples he uses, because if you were to lay in bed and never use your body, your bones would get weaker and weaker.
Yeah.
But the stress of force and conflict and just usage actually makes your bones stronger and stronger. And children are that way. Coming up against obstacles and being frustrated and being bored and having challenges to overcome makes them stronger. And yes, there is a threshold. There is a point where it's no longer beneficial, but overprotecting is also not beneficial. And so finding that balance can be so tricky as a parent. And one of the things I like to, I guess, comfort myself with and comfort other parents with is you're still the parent. You're the primary influence. So if they're getting exposed to slightly different views from your parents or your husband's parents or your brother, like, it's not necessarily going to make them into that person or have that belief. It's showing them that we're different people and we coexist with these different people because we love them and care about them, and we can hold space for different beliefs and still hold our beliefs. And I think that that's really valuable. I would like to have, if you wouldn't mind, a few more examples of ways to maybe approach some of these conversations. So I find it challenging if I'm assuming that it's going to be a fight. Like you said, I did not have practice with conflict as a kid.
I get it.
Conflict wasn't allowed on my end.
Or conflict was, like the parents were allowed to,
Exactly. And so doing that now as an adult where it's like, oh, I fundamentally disagree, let's take that and not scream and yell at each other, but let's actually have a conversation. That's new.
Yeah, and I think it can go either way. Like if you grew up in a household like that, then that's the way you communicate, is the screaming and yelling. Some people just shut down and feel like their voice wasn't heard as a kid. So, and see, one thing I notice is I think people tend to swing the pendulum really far the opposite direction. Like I can see it from my grandmother to my mother to me, even now to my son. We try and give our kids what we needed that we didn't get as a child, and it's not always what they need. And sometimes we swing the pendulum too far. So what I mean by that is, like, I never felt like I had a voice when I was a kid. It was my parents' way, and that's just the way it was, and I didn't feel like my opinions or what I wanted was respected. So I tried to make sure that my kids always have a voice, always have a say, always are able to say, I don't agree with this. I will admit myself, I've gone too far the other way. And sometimes I don't set boundaries. And sometimes they're way more vocal than, they should be about things. And so now I get mad because they're not respectful. But then I think, well, like, you're the one that didn't put the boundary there. So I think a lot of times, one, we try and give kids what we didn't have that isn't necessarily what they need. And two, sometimes we go too far the opposite extreme.
And I think that happens because we're villainizing a behavior based on our emotions without seeing this spectrum that behavior might be. So telling a kid no. For you, that might have been every day, all the time. Every time you wanted to have an opinion or a voice, you weren't allowed. But that doesn't mean telling a kid no is bad.
Right.
It's the way it was done and how often it was done. And so, but if there's a spectrum, and if we admit that maybe there is a way, and there is, obviously, like, to tell kids no sometimes where it is appropriate, then we can't just be mad at our parents.
Yes.
And I think sometimes that is hard. That's painful to let go of some of the self-righteous anger, or especially if we haven't made peace and we haven't ever been told, like, hey, I'm sorry for when I screwed up, which is very rare for somebody to hear these days. We want to hold on to all of our list of complaints, but then we do things that maybe resemble something our parents would have done. And it's like, how do we navigate this? And I think it's important to recognize that for the vast majority of us, our parents were not evil.
No.
They were not trying to cause harm. They might have been very misinformed. They might have had kind of logical fallacies, like, oh, well, I don't want you to touch the stove, so I'll smack you because I'd rather hurt you a little bit than take you to the hospital.
Right.
Without ever knowing or considering, like, hey, there's like 25 other things you can do rather than smack your kid that would also result in them not going to the hospital from touching the hot stove,
Absolutely.
But they didn't know that. And I think one of the places of common interest or common ground that my mother and I have found is that I can absolutely concede that there is a privilege and a benefit to living in today's world. I have at my fingertips at any given moment thousands of opinions and suggestions and ideas that I can access via Google. She did not have that.
No, she had her neighbors and her family. And
her upbringing, and that was it. And good enough was that was it. There was no mass, like, crowdsourcing for information. So
Yeah.
how great is it that we have that now? And if we can, what I do find I can do now is share information as if I've just learned it. Do you know what I heard? Do you know what I
Yes.
read? Rather than, no,
Beautiful.
you're doing it wrong, this is the right way. Even though literally it's my job to
Absolutely.
tell people like, hey, here's an idea. I cannot present it that way to my parents because it feels disrespectful to them. It feels
To
like I'm judging
anybody.
you.
To anybody, really, though. Like if your husband came up to you and said, you shouldn't be doing it this way, you should be doing it this way, would that make you look at it and be like, oh, yeah, I think he's right? Or would it make you feel like you had to defend your position? Right? So I think it's with everybody. And the other thing is, like, so often we think what we are doing is right. And oftentimes, yes, you do know what's best for your kids. Your intuition will tell you what's best for your kids. And sometimes we get our own stuff mixed up in that, our own unhealed wounds, and we think we're doing what's best for them. And it may not be. And like a perfect example is my boys. I have 13-year-old and my twins are about to be 5. And I have really tried to raise them as conscious young men without this like toxic masculinity, and to be kind and to be, you know, just a different way. And my 13-year-old recently has started saying things to me like, I think you're being too easy on the boys. You need to toughen them up. They're going to get bullied when they go to school. They're going to get picked on. You need to be harder on them. And when I start reading between the lines, he hasn't come right out and told me this, but just in the things I can see him saying, I think he got bullied at school for being too quote unquote soft. So now, from his experience of how I raised him, he wishes that I would have raised him differently. So he may very well grow up and be harder on his kids because of what he experienced. I think I'm doing the right thing, and maybe that wasn't exactly what he needed. So, based on our experience, you know, he may parent his kids very differently, but I think, oh, I'm the one doing the right thing and everybody else is wrong, and everybody else should conform to how I want my kids raised. And that's where, and again, this is so much easier for me to give this advice to other people than to do it in my own life. But I really try to look at those places in myself and think like, why do I feel that way? And is this a belief that really works for me still? Great, keep it. Or is it somewhere that my ego is getting in the way, or my own unhealed stuff is getting in the way? And is there a different perspective here?
I agree. And I think that you are particularly skilled at introspection, which is why I love talking to you, even when we do come from opposite points of view, because I never feel like you are seeking to prove me wrong. You're seeking to have a conversation and to share your experience and hear mine. And we are there on equal ground. And I think that if we can do that more, we will make it a lot farther. There's just so many examples of this. And, and I think that one of the things that can happen with your son in this exact situation is, he doesn't at this moment know what that even means to be tougher on them. Like,
right.
And so we can take that goal, because this actually, even though this is your son, this often happens with dads in my business where they're like, no, like he can't be a wuss. Like, you don't understand what it's like to be a boy in middle school. And so, we see that as toxic or damaging, but that's a place of love. Like, they're trying to protect their child just as much. And so what is it that we can do to help this child to develop toughness, if you will? Well, what that means to me is resiliency. It is challenges that they have to overcome. It's allowing them to be frustrated and not rushing in to fix it for them. If you really want to get more literal, let's sign up for a karate class. Like, let's do this masculine viewed thing in a controlled, dedicated, focused way that is taught with a lot of respect and a lot of self-discipline. I think that's one of the things I love about a lot of martial arts. The way it's taught is very often about, you're gaining these skills, and with these skills comes responsibility to use them appropriately. And so we can meet the need for allowing some toughness. And we can, I think one of the dangers with the toxic masculinity idea that has been so prevalent is that it gets warped into the masculine is bad, and it's not.
Yes.
Being protective, being a leader, being um, strong, being loud, being a go-getter, being an achiever, those masculine traits, one, are neither for men or for women, they're for humans, and they're positive traits. And we
Yeah.
don't have to destroy all of that because we don't want to be stuck with boys don't cry.
But again, it's the pendulum swinging too far to the
Yes.
opposite end, right? And not being in the middle. And then you have my friend who just told me that her ex-husband is telling her 8-month-old grandson, don't cry, don't be a baby at 8 months.
He's literally
You know? Don't cry, boys don't cry. You know, so like there's extremes of every end. Where can you meet in the middle? And I feel like the place we can meet in the middle is look at somebody's intention. Look at, do they love your kids? Do they, is it really that they're horrible people, or have they just had a really hard life that maybe they haven't been able to deal with in the same way that you can? I hear a lot of like, well, they're adults, they should know better. And again, especially if you're the Pathfinder, you know that if there's something wrong in your life, it's up to you to fix it. And like you take responsibility for that, you do that. Some adults are just so broken that they can't get to that point. So theoretically, yes, they should know better, but maybe they don't. And maybe by having a conversation with them, that's the way to kind of enlighten them, and I think, and this is a much milder example of this, but I just had this conversation this morning with somebody who was saying that her dad was tickling her daughter, and her daughter was saying, stop. And the dad kept tickling. Now, she said, the time before this happened, I went off on my dad and I was like, just stop tickling her. She said, stop means stop, And when you go at it that way, the dad is like, what the hell? What the heck? I'm just trying to have, fun with my granddaughter. What is going on? And they think you're overreacting. So this time when it happened, she was like, Dad, if a guy ever is holding her down when she's a teenager and she says stop and he keeps going, do you want her to just be quiet? And the dad was like, oh, I never thought of it that way. So there's a teaching moment. Now, she said to me, will he do it again? Probably. But the intention there is like, I'm just having a good time with my granddaughter. The intention is not, I'm going to make somebody mad, or I'm going to, you know what I mean? So I think a lot of times you have to look at the intention and just keep having the conversation. So and again, a lot easier said than done in my own life. Very easy for me to see both sides of a situation in somebody else's life, but a lot harder to practice in person. So none of it is easy. And like what you said before about us having conversations, even when we feel differently, I love that, because like I didn't let my kids roughhouse until I talked to you and saw it in a different way, So I think the key is to like try not to be defensive, get your ego out of the way, and just see if there's something that you can learn from one another.
Absolutely. I agree. And I think so in my experience, I find I have a much easier time talking to other people's parents or other people's spouses.
Oh yeah.
But I can use those experiences to help me to do better. And it is challenging because I think I automatically assume they're not interested in learning, whether that's my parents or my in-laws. Basically that generation, I just at some point decided, and maybe it was just my upbringing, like I'm not allowed to educate above me age-wise. Yeah. So I'm just going to shut up and do it my way. And if you don't like it, go away. And what is damaging with that is that it builds this resentment, and yeah. The people that are good people that do love your children immensely, and you want them to have a relationship with your kid. If you're sitting there with all of this angst and resentment, that's going to interfere with that positive relationship. And so being able to say, hey, this is how we do this. This is what we think is right. This is whatever. Sometimes starting that conversation even with, how was this handled when you were growing up? And listening.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law's mother grew up in the Great Depression. Yeah. And so food was like a hot button issue. Like, yeah. and my father-in-law's parents too. So, for them, like not finishing your food
don't waste.
Was a sin. And I remember being told that, and it always seemed so bizarre to me, like that was such a big deal, but I don't blame people, and we have this anti-diet culture now because of so many eating disorders and all this stuff. And I think it's great that we're sharing this information and we're helping parents to have better relationships with food themselves and helping to develop better relationships with food with their kids. But if we just say to somebody, stop shaming them, you're going to cause an eating disorder, it's very strong. Like,
yeah, and not only that, but that was like the last of their intentions, right?
Yeah.
Like they're not intending for that to happen.
No.
Yeah, and I mean, I love the way you approach it, like, hey, do you know what I just learned? And or something like that, because like that's a perfect example. I was always taught as a kid, finish your plate, there's starving children in Africa. Well, me finishing my plate is not going to make anybody else less hungry, right? But that was their way.
There's a dry bar comedy skit on YouTube on this exact topic.
Right? But what it does teach is our kids to shut off their natural hunger cues. To eat, like this is a perfect example of something I used to believe that I have completely flipped on. I remember when my oldest son was like maybe first grade, I was talking to another mom and she was like, yeah, we have food in my house and my kids eat when they're hungry. And I'm like, what do you mean they eat when you're hungry? They're hungry. They don't have like a dinner time, set dinner time? Because in my house, it was always, don't eat that, you'll spoil your dinner. And then I had to finish what was on my plate. So what does that teach me? When I'm hungry, I'm not allowed to eat, but when I'm full, I'm not allowed to stop, right? So you're turning off the natural hunger cues for your body. And I thought she was crazy when she was like, my kids just eat when they want to. Now, I will say family mealtime is important to me, like to all sit down together. But I really started looking at this and like, wow, if I make my kids eat at 5 o'clock every night, but then they're hungry at 8 and I tell them, no, you can't have food because you didn't eat your dinner. Well, maybe they weren't hungry at 5 o'clock and maybe they are hungry now. They have tiny little bellies. It doesn't hold as long as it will me now. Yes, sometimes do my kids use it as an excuse not to go to bed? Yes, so then we put limits around it, like, okay, after 8 o'clock, you can't ask for food. If you're hungry before this time, you ask. If I say it's time for bed and you say I'm hungry, that doesn't work. But it really made me start evaluating these rules I had around food and what time we eat, when you're allowed to eat, and don't eat now because you're hungry, finish your plate when you're full. Like, that was something I was brought up with that I really changed my point of view about, just because I was willing to listen to somebody else. But had somebody approach me in the way you were saying, like, this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this, and then I would get defensive and there's nowhere to go. And I see this a lot in situations where, like, let's say it's parents again, and one parent has a behavior you don't want your kids around, so then you go to the other quote unquote reasonable parent and try and talk to them. And I think what people don't realize that does is that puts that person in an impossible situation, because now you're asking them to choose between their spouse and you and your kids. And I think if you're not willing to look at the implications of that, then you just get mad at the quote unquote reasonable parent because they're not doing something different, when really they're in kind of a tight situation.
It's not theirs to do to change their spouse.
Right.
I think that's something that is important. I follow the TJ Ed model for homeschooling, and that's something that the people who teach that topic say a lot. What is yours to do? Whether it's with your children, whether it's with your spouse, whether it's with your parents, like, some of it is yours to do, like attempting to see their side, starting a conversation, being an example of how you want interactions to go. And some of it isn't. It isn't your job to change your parents. If the behavior is damaging and it is toxic, yes, you have to create those boundaries. And if you create the boundary before ever saying, hey, this is concerning to me, can we talk about it?
Right.
Could be eliminating a relationship that could be very beneficial. And sometimes you're not ready. And I totally empathize with that. And you have to sort of learn how to have conflict safely if you never learned how to do that before. And you might need to have that conflict, which honestly, conflict is a scary word, but it really is. Anytime two people disagree, it is a conflict.
Yeah.
It can be a very minor conflict.
But that right there shows our point of view about it, because I consider like a disagreement a conflict, whereas my husband would say we're just having a conversation. right? So that's because I'm the same. I don't want any kind of what I would consider conflict, but what you and I consider conflict may just be a discussion to somebody else.
Yeah. And I think that, it's worth asking the question, can I have this conversation? Do I want to preserve this relationship? Even if it's not a relationship that's going to ever be super great between me and that person, are they good to my kids? Because that's the thing.
Yes.
My dad and I, but he is really good to my kids. And
See,
I mean, like, I have to give him that. I can have anger and resentment. And like, I mean, I was so on edge. We went to Vegas and visited, and this is the first time we'd seen him in 4 years. And he happened to come to my mom's house. That's how that happened. But, he's playing with my boys, and he's playing rough and obnoxious. And my 6-year-old was trying to get him to stop so that he could say something else. And my 6-year-old is very strong-headed, like, and I could see him getting worked up, and he tried to kick my dad, and my heart about stopped, because I know this, like, explosive man. I don't. Yeah. And Xavier, I said his name in that tone, and me doing that triggered my dad to see Xavier's frustration. And he actually said, "Oh, okay, I wasn't listening to you." And I literally, like, wanted to cry, almost fell out of my seat. I've never seen this man, like, concede to a child. Like, I mean, all of the explosive things in my head, like, how did this even happen? And I was so grateful for that experience, because it's worth it now for my kids to have that relationship. It isn't a toxic relationship for them.
Right.
There's a lot of baggage. I don't know if we'll ever work through it all, but he's good to them. And it's important for me to make that distinction. And now, do I trust his impulse control, my father's impulse control? No. Would I let him babysit my kids? No. But will I let him come play with them sometimes? Sure. I can still have boundaries and let them foster a relationship together.
I think that is an absolutely beautiful example. And you wouldn't be surprised, well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, how many times I have heard like I just had a friend say to me, the stories my mom tells about my grandma, I can't believe it's the same woman, because I did not have that experience with her. Mm-hmm. And so had you not allowed that to happen, had you just shut off the relationship, you never would have had the opportunity to experience that, right?
Yeah.
And the thing that I will say about that is, how much is your son healing your dad? And some people will say, like, it's not my kid's place to heal my parents. But how beautiful if we can work together as a family to heal our issues, right? To have your dad be a different, better person because of your
kid. I mean, and he can be an excellent grandparent, because I think partly because all of the responsibility and the weight isn't on him.
Yes.
I mean, virtually, he, in my personal opinion, he has mental health issues.
Yeah.
Aside from that, he believed that he was protecting us by being incredibly hard on us.
Yes.
And while I don't feel that way towards my own children, I can say that those words, if I am hard on you, then you will be safer in the world. If that's what he truly believes, then of course he was.
Yeah.
And by hard on, I mean, like, completely losing his ever-loving mind.
Yeah.
Like, I don't mean hard on, like, no, I'm not bringing you your homework, you should have put it in your backpack, you're 13 years old. Like, that's everybody has different definitions for different.
Absolutely. But if you whittle it down to the core, and this is the core of almost everything, is he loved you, and people are doing the best they can with the tools they have at the time.
I was literally about to say the same thing.
Yeah, like Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you do better. Like, you do the best you can until you know better, and then once you know better, do better, right?
And it's so often that's thrown at people, like, well, I'm better than you because
yes.
I'm better. No. That's not what we're getting at here. What we're saying is that for the vast majority of people, they are doing the best they can. Are there evil people in the world? I honestly think there are. Some of the horrific atrocities that I've seen, yep, that's just, I can't fix those people. I don't think I can help those people. However, that's such a tiny fraction. And media blows it up, and social media blows it up.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like everyone and all over the place, and it isn't. The vast, vast, vast majority of people are doing the absolute best they can with their current aim. And it's something I wrote in the book. It's your level of assistance. It's the information you have right now. And it's the mindset that you have right now. And those things change with time. You know, maybe my dad seeing me parent differently made him wonder if it was worth interacting differently with my kids.
Yeah. You know? And maybe you taught him something just by being the example. Yeah. You taught him a different way. You didn't have to say, hey, Dad, I don't do the same thing.
Yeah, you're doing
I would never do to my kid. Yeah, I would never do to my kid what you did to me. Hey, watch what I do now. But just by seeing you do that differently, it clicked something in his brain. And he may very well wish he had parented you differently. But a lot of people will never be able to say, I'm sorry. A lot of people will never be able to say, admit that they wish they had done it differently.
Do I think everybody's capable of that? I don't know. And I'm not here to say that if you have cut off a family member, that that's the wrong choice. I trust people to make that choice for themselves. I think there are absolutely valid reasons and valid seasons where you can have absolutely no contact, and that is better for you. I'm in, like I said, certain support groups for people with narcissistic
I agree.
parents. There's not much you can do there. And if that's not what you want, there are options.
And I think, too, if you had believed your dad would never change and just cut off the relationship right then, you would have never seen that change in him. If you had said, and I know you're not like this, but I think a lot of people are like, my kid, my choice right from the get-go, and don't ever try and talk about that. Like my mom will be the first one to say to me, I have learned so much from you. But it's because I try and present it in a way that doesn't shame her, right? And if you look at it from your dad's point of view, like let's look at his conditioning. And if you're doing something that is against every single thing he's been taught since he was a child, he's not just going to change his mind overnight.
Well, and I have to give my sister credit, because I did cut him off. 4 years ago, I was in a deeply healing place, and I was working through some intense, like, yuck. And I was assigned the task of no contact, and it was terrifying to put up such a firm boundary.
Yeah, but sometimes that's what you need.
I cried, and I was so scared the first text message I ignored, which honestly is kind of absurd, because what had happened prior to that was he told me he was done with me.
Okay.
And so basically, I just silently agreed a couple months later.
Yeah.
I never made a spectacle. I never told him. I didn't respond to one text message, and he did not talk to me for 4 years. And that was honestly a great thing for me to develop my comfort, my strength, my security, and for him to deal with whatever he was dealing with. And then when my sister was pregnant, she would tell me things that he was saying to her that were like supportive. He's still him. He still says really off-color things.
Well, yeah, but there's a tiny piece of that has to be acceptance. Like, okay, I accept who you are, and that you're moving at the pace that you can move. His pace might be way slower than yours. But let me ask you this, because this is somewhere that maybe you can help me have a different point of view about. When you just cut him off and didn't tell him you were doing it, what's the reasoning behind that? Because like in my mind, I think give him the opportunity to know what you're doing. Like say, I have to cut this off because it's not healthy for me, or whatever, just instead of like him wondering what is going on, because often people don't see what they're doing is wrong. So then one side just cuts off contact and doesn't say anything. So like help me understand that part of it.
So the biggest reason is that I, possibly to this day, do not know how to have conflict with him without being unsafe. He can explode. He can become very violent. Like,
so it was like you feeling safe to not say, like, I'm cutting off contact.
I don't know how to be like, okay, so we're not going to talk. Like, that wasn't an option for me emotionally. Now, The catalyst prior to that was he told me that I was the R word and that he was done with me, and he hung up.
Gotcha.
And
Okay.
I
So
was like, okay, cool. So that happened. And then a couple of months later, when I was working through my own stuff with sort of therapy-like kind of work, and this mentor, one of my biggest like fears, just constant anxiety and fear, was essentially my father, like anxiety 24/7. And she's like, cut him off. And I'm like, oh, I can't do that. That would make him angry. And she's like, then you have to. Like, not to make him angry, but if you cannot have a boundary, like,
right.
practice having a boundary. And it was because of that, that was what I meant when I said, like, I basically just silently disagreed, because we weren't talking anyway.
Gotcha. Okay. So it wasn't like, because see, in my family, it's different. In my family, there's a situation where, let's say there's this guy and he believes that somebody treated him wrong in his family. And now the person that he believes treated him wrong, so there hasn't been any contact. The person he believes treated him wrong is trying to come back around and have conversations and make things okay. And then this guy is like not willing to do any of it. So it's not nearly as volatile a situation as what you have, but it's like someone's reaching out, the other person is not responding at all. And to me, it's like, okay, if somebody is willing to make the effort and try to change, could you at least be open to hearing what they have to say?
If he had contacted me, like I said, I ignored one text message. I was literally driving into the mountains and losing signal. And I just was like, I've already lost signal. And I just put my phone away.
Yeah, so it's not like he was reaching out and you were just like, you know, like one day you just said, I'm not talking to you.
No, not at all. And if he had, there were several big catalyst kind of things in our family, and I expected that he would reach out, and he never did. And if he had, I was open to having those conversations, because they were really big, like traumatic things in our family. And he didn't. And I just, my assumption, for whatever that's worth, because we all know what assuming gets you, was that he was dealing with enough and wasn't sure how I would react and didn't really want to pile that on top. And so I just kind of took the piece and was grateful for it and pushed it off. And we never did talk about any of the conflict. We just kind of let it go. And it's not the kind of relationship where like we call each other and chit chat, but you know, I was in Vegas, I had moved to Idaho, I went back and visited, and my sister was like, well, can I have dad come over? I'm like, sure. Like, you know.
But I think in your case, like dredging up all that old stuff when things are moving in a different direction may not be the right thing to do. And again, every situation is different. There may be a situation with a family that it would be really helpful to talk about that stuff. But like in your case, while things seem to be changing and moving in the right direction, I would say as long as you're good with that, let it go, you know.
That's
like
my belief too. I think I think, you know, there are times when it's really appropriate to dig in. But like these circumstances, like they're never going to happen again.
But I think too, like what just occurred to me in your whole situation is you seeing your dad react differently with your son. I wonder if that's part of your healing too, like to see that he can be a different person, to see that he is capable of something else. So this is where I say to the people that might say like, not my kid's job to heal my dad, not my job to heal my dad. And at the same time, how much healing does that provide for you?
It absolutely
does.
And it doesn't do any harm. That's where I need to find. If it were harming my child in some way,
absolutely.
Absolutely. Get
totally
out.
Agree. Yep.
But if it's not, like if his healing is playing with my kid and making him happy, that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. And sometimes I think cutting off the relationship is detrimental to your kid, because if your kid has a loving relationship with the grandfather, doesn't understand why you have the problems with him you do because he doesn't see that, then it almost might be harder on the kid if you cut the relationship off. But again, you have to be a strong person to be able to do that, because it makes you face your own stuff.
And you have to decide, you know, what is the level of toxicity. If it's, you know, if you buy my kids candy and cookies so they think you're the greatest, but you treat me like C.R.E every time you see me, not healthy. But if it's like, you know, basically like with my dad and I, we don't discuss parenting at all. He has made an effort to be kind to my children. And that's really the greatest thing another human being can do for me, is to be kind to my children. So do I need, and I've done a ton of work, like years and years and years of healing. Like not everybody is in that place, but for me, in my situation, I can let go enough to be like, this taking that, that lens all the way in and just focusing on my two sons playing Moana with my dad. That is positive. That I can allow. And just letting that be what it is without all of the other baggage piled on top.
Yeah. And I think you've made two really important points. One is like, there are different times and different stages. At one stage, you needed to cut him off for your own healing. And then you did your own healing. And now you're in a place where you're ready to be open to being around him. 4 years ago, you might not have had the same reaction.
But yeah, I think every situation is unique, but I think it's valuable to consider that for most people, almost everybody, they are doing the best that they can in their current situation. Now, sometimes those situations mean that they can't be trusted. They're a drug addict and they're, completely unpredictable, or an alcoholic, or a narcissist. Like in those situations, it isn't something that is going to necessarily change where you can be like, hey, like, let's have this conversation. It'll be great. And it's okay to know that and to uphold that. And it's okay to be like, man, I want to do things differently than my parents, but I still want to like have them in my kids' lives, and to find ways to make that feel safe for everybody. And I think there is a beauty and a benefit in that. And it can be tricky. And I think I'm going to speak for myself, but I assume you too, like, if listeners are struggling with this and they want to talk to somebody and figure out how to have boundaries that allow relationships to flourish, or even how to have conversations, like, you're welcome to talk to me about it. I assume that they
absolutely.
So in the show description, I will put contact info. As always, you can set up a free call with S.U.R.E Parenting at bit.ly/callsammy. But we are both in the Facebook group Empowering Moms to Uplift Kids. And Kim will give me her contact, and I'll put that in the description too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just remembered what I wanted to say earlier. I think sometimes the beauty of not having a conversation with somebody is just leading by example. Like you said, you don't talk about parenting with your kid or with your dad. That's a situation where talking about it probably wouldn't get you anywhere. But modeling the behavior that, like, the mom that you want to be, and him seeing that, I think sometimes can be much more productive than having a conversation about it. So there's a time for talking, and then there's a time for modeling. And I think you intuitively kind of know when that is.
I agree. I totally agree. So
yeah.
Thank you so much for
Thank you.
I know this is a long one, but it's a very valuable one.
Sorry, and I feel like I could talk for hours about it. Maybe we'll have to do a part 2.
I would love that. I think it would be fantastic to do another part, and maybe a couple of parts, because I think this issue is going to keep coming up. I mean, as we evolve and learn more about the child's brain and psychology and development and all of these different tools and resources that we have available now, we're going to keep shifting. And we will see that pendulum swing you talked about, and we will shift back. So I think one thing I didn't say that is really important to me is that I do not present myself as some sort of perfect parent ever. And I don't believe that the perfect parent exists. What I believe will help my kids with whatever they have problems with in my choices raising them, that, is the knowledge that they're allowed to tell me that. They can come to me and say, hey, you used to do blah, 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 and that sucked. And I can sit in that and think and be in their shoes, because I've been doing that their whole lives. I can put myself into their situation and imagine how they feel about this or this or this, and they're free to tell me. My 6-year-old, like I said, he is an old soul, and he will sometimes tell me, I'll have a bad attitude or a short temper or something, and he will do to me what I do to him, which is, could you not talk to me with that tone? And with my husband, he'll tell him, I think you need to go do some qigong or like meditating so that you're calmer.
And what I absolutely agree with you. And what if we could have that same open-mindedness that we have with our kids telling us that to everybody we come in contact with? Because I think with a lot of other people, we immediately get defensive.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you do that, but I think a lot of us do. I know that's my heart. Like my kids could say something to me and I will apologize to my kids in a heartbeat. It is so much harder to do that with my husband.
So much harder. We need to do that podcast. Apologize to your husband when you don't want to.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming and being here with us today.
Thank you, Sammy. Really, and thank you so much for what you do, because I have learned so much from you and from your group, and just being willing to stay open to different possibilities.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.